The Holy Gospel is written in the 13th chapter of St. Luke, beginning at the 31st verse. At that very hour, some Pharisees came and said to Jesus, "Get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you." He said to them, "Go and tell that fox for me, listen, I am casting out demons and performing cures today and tomorrow, and on the third day I finish my work. Yet today, tomorrow, and the next day I must be on my way, because it is impossible for a prophet to be killed outside of Jerusalem. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those that are sent to it. How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you, and I tell you, you will not see me until the time comes when you say, 'Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord.'" Here ends the gospel for the day. Please be seated. Cabin doors had been closed. The seats were all upright. The seat belts were all firmly fastened. And the attendant said those words that we all know so well when we're flying, those words that talk about where the exits are and what to do in an emergency. And as the attendant sat down, the captain got on the phone. He said, "This is Captain Thompson. We are leaving Denver very shortly. Our destination today is Minneapolis, Minnesota. We will be flying at an altitude of 30,000 feet at approximately 600 miles an hour. And we will be started as soon as I get enough nerve to fly this plane." Immediately there was a burst of laughter. How absurd is this? The pilot is talking on the microphone, and he's announcing that he's afraid to fly? How can this be? Certainly, it's a joke, and we'll take it as that. I wondered if maybe there was more truth than fiction in what the pilot said. Isn't it a big responsibility to have on board anywhere from 100 to 400 people and be responsible for their lives and know that any kind of small mistake you might make might drive hundreds to the grave? And then I discovered online that of the most dangerous occupations, being a pilot is one of the ones with most stress. They stress about their job. They are afraid to take off and afraid to land. Sorry to tell you that, those that are flying in the next week. But as you look at the various occupations, and particularly those that are listed as the most stressful, it is easy to understand there is fear in things that people do every day. The surgeon, as he approaches the person he is about to do surgery upon, certainly has some fears about what could go wrong, because very often it does. And they have to be prepared for anything that can go wrong. People's bodies do not respond the same depending upon who the person is. The law enforcement people, as they go to work in the morning, have to have a little bit of fear about their work, because they understand, is so evident in the newspapers and on the newscast these days, it is dangerous to be in that occupation. Because any one person, whether you stop them for some minor violation or some major crime, there is always a possibility of some kind of retaliation. Ministers have a fear of preaching on Sunday morning. You probably didn't know that. But before you go and begin a sermon, there's a great amount of anxiety about what you're going to say. Will it be taken right? Will somebody misunderstand it? Will somebody fall asleep? Children go to school fearing because they've seen the news. They've heard the reports. Sometimes it's just dangerous to go to school. Maybe it isn't surprising to have someone in any kind of occupation say, I'm going to begin when I get enough nerve. And sometimes you understand, sometimes it just takes a lot of nerve to get up in the morning. In our gospel text today, Jesus is warned. Somebody comes up to Jesus early in his ministry and he says, and they say to him, somebody is out to kill you. Herod doesn't like what you're doing. And you better watch out. Take us seriously. He is after you. He will get you. Jesus understood that there was a danger. He knew of Herod. He knew that Herod was a tyrant. He knew that Herod was living openly with his brother's wife and making a show of it to the people, just to show he could. He knew that Herod was a murderer because he had murdered his cousin, John the Baptist. And I imagine when Jesus heard these words from the Pharisees, designed to scare him, it probably did, if he was truly human, as we assume in this church that he was. And so how did Jesus respond to the fear in his life? I think, first of all, Jesus simply was able to always name his fears. Whether it was the temptation from Satan or the temptation maybe not to go through with his designed mission, or maybe when he was threatened with death, he was always to understand what was real and what was not real in terms of fear. The question is, have you designated in your own life what you're really afraid of, and whether they are really actual fears that need to be taken into consideration as far as your life? Who or what is your Herod today? The psychologists have designated at least 100 fears. 100 fears. Some people seem to have them all. A lot of them are designated as what we call faceless fears. And they include those death, loss of job, sickness, those things that really don't pose much of a threat today, but could pose some threat in the not too distant future. The reality is that we have to determine in our life which fears are real fears and which ones are fears that we do not have to take seriously because we have the power to control them. It's all right to be afraid. That's part of the self-preservation gift that you have been given by God. Fear is not uncommon. Fear is a reality. The second thing that Jesus was able to do was to brand the courage after he learned in his own mind what needed to be taken into consideration and what didn't. He faced his fears with a great deal of courage. Jesus said to the people that warned him, "Go tell that fox that I know what he's up to, but I'm about my work. And I'm not going to be worried about it because until I get to Jerusalem, I don't have to worry about it. Because Jerusalem is where I'm going to come under a lot of fire." And then Jesus takes his mission seriously. He says, "I'm going and do all my ministry and go into Jerusalem only at the last minute. When the rest of my ministry is finished, when I feel that I've completed what I've come here to do, then I will go." A great deal of our lives consists of bracing ourselves and protecting ourselves from those things that we fear. In the Old Testament, the mandate goes out from the Egyptian Pharaoh that all the young boys under 2 shall be killed. He wanted to stop the growth, the population of the Israelites, so they didn't overcome the Egyptians. And one by one, the mothers faced their fears and tried to find out ways that they could deal with that terrible plague that was there in Egypt. And Moses' mother does the job very well. She knows there's a risk, and she goes and puts Moses in the river and floats him down the stream, follows him to make sure that he doesn't drown, but make sure that he gets into an area where there are women that are swimming because she feels that they will take refuge on a poor child. That's what mothers do. She's successful. And she gets pulled in and asked to be one of the maids in the household. And that's done at some risk to her, but she faces her fears, knows what the penalty is if she doesn't take risks. Martin Luther, when he went before the Diet to defend what he had written, went about making sure that he had safe passage, to make sure that for everything that he had done, everything that was possible to be done, he would be safe from the persecution that he thought might come as a result of defending his views. He realized there was a risk, but his conscience drove him. But he protected himself as much as he could. In the Second World War, there were many people that felt that there was a moral debacle in Germany in destroying one race of people. They decided, a lot of people decided, that they should take this thing seriously and defend those that were helpless. They understood in hiding the Jews and helping them to escape from Germany might risk their own death. But they were willing to take it. They were willing to face the fear and move on. Only in doing that can you overcome the fear and make something good happen out of bad. One by one, we can look at things in our lives and understand that a lot of the reasons we don't do great things is because we're afraid of the consequences. We're afraid to deal with them. And yet we understand the only way to overcome fear is to face it, to label it, and then work courageously to protect yourself. The final thing that Jesus did was to know that God was with him at all times. When he went into the garden, he was so afraid that he sweat drops of blood. And he prayed that God would be with him in this terrible hour of his, the terrible hour of suffering. He said, the only way I can face fear is if I put my life in your hands and trust that good will come of these bad hours that I am to face. We need to put our trust in God in those hours that seem so dark. Isn't it strange that the last time we had a real resurgence in church attendance and church activism was 9/11, the date America got attacked. And all of a sudden the churches were filled because we were filled with fear. Why is it that it takes something that catastrophic to surge a resurgence in activity that are religious? Tom McLennan was a track and field coach at the University of Wisconsin. He died in a plane accident. He was well beloved by his school, his students, and his community. One of the things that is little known about him was that he had a son with leukemia. And in 4th grade, the son began to slip. And finally, the doctors said that hope was lost. He said, "I did not know how to deal with this tragedy in my life, and I was very afraid. But I knew my son was afraid too. And I sat down with him a number of times during those last days of his confinement in the hospital. And finally I said, 'Son, Jesus is waiting to hold you in his arms.' And the son replied, 'I know, Dad. He's standing right beside you.' It was a family of faith. And even in the tragic hours when fear was the greatest, they put their trust and their hope and their confidence in God's grace and knew that good would come of evil, that life would come as a result of death. When we were bombed in World War II in Pearl Harbor, our president got on the radio and told us we had nothing to fear but fear itself. And this morning, the message from Scripture is just the same. Yes, there are going to be fears, but if we let fears encompass us, and the only thing we see is fear, then we'll lose sight of the holy. Name your fears, face them with courage, and trust that God will walk through them with you. Amen. Sermon hymn